Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. You can also engage with us through Twitter and Facebook. We would love to hear from you. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone. On today's episode, we're going to explore a fundamental question about missions. We're going to ask the question, what is the Great Commission? We'll be speaking with a guest who has not only studied the Great Commission in great detail and written about it, but also has decades of experience engaging this topic with people around the world. Our guest today is Paul Borthwick, who, along with his wife Christy, serves on the staff of Development Associates International, which focuses on leadership development in the majority world. Paul taught for 30 years at Gordon College and is the author of many books, including his newest book, The Fellowship of the Suffering, How Hardship Shapes Us for Ministry. For those of you who may be members of Missio Nexus, there are book reviews of Paul's books, including this newest one there, and I look forward to engaging that one, Paul. Our focus today, however, is on one of his previous books, a 2015 book entitled Great Commission, Great Compassion, Following Jesus and Loving the World. So, Paul, what led you to write this book, Great Commission, Great Compassion?
Two things, Mags, that were really the compelling force behind it. One is the age-old discussion of word versus deed, good works versus preaching the gospel, doing works of compassion versus evangelism. And so Great Commission talks about basically making disciples, doing the evangelistic part of things, the spoken word, if you will, whereas Great Compassion is more from Matthew 25, dealing with how you fed me, how you clothed me, how you welcomed me in type of compassionate outreach. The second thing that compelled it, though, was the number of people I would meet in churches who were zealous to be involved in some sort of cross-cultural ministry, especially short-term missions, but they had no biblical foundation for it. If I asked them what the Great Commission was, they would have a blank look on their face because they really didn't understand that we weren't doing missions because it's a cool thing to do or because of the global village, but we're doing missions because it's the compelling heart of God as revealed in Jesus' words in the New Testament.
To your first point, Paul, when you talk about the Great Commission, Great Compassion, do you feel that the church is finding a balance there, or do we tend to tip to one or the other?
The tendency is to tip to one towards the other. And if you would, in my younger years, it was, we have to preach the word and, outreach and compassionate care comes second. In the younger generation now, it's almost like justice is more important than justification. And so we want to liberate the slaves, which is great, but preaching the word doesn't come in to play a part. So the pendulum swings back and forth, as it has even through the ages of the church, I believe.
Mm-hmm. And a challenge before us is to make sure we have the both and instead of either or. And how do we maintain that balance wisely, graciously? Let's move to this main question, Paul. What exactly is the Great Commission?
As an illustration of the church's sort of lack of knowledge of this, I recall one time at my own home church in Lexington, Mass., I was speaking in a Sunday school class about our church's role in the Great Commission. And I used the phrase Great Commission over and over again, but never unpacked it, never explained it. There was a young guy in the audience who was a fairly new Christian, and I went and I asked him that question. I said, what do you think is the Great Commission? This is at the end of the class. And he looked at me kind of like deer in the headlights, and he said, well, I'd guess 30%. And
Wow.
I said, what?
Yeah.
I said, what? He goes, well, I'm a salesperson, and a good commission would be 10%, and a better commission would be 20%, but I think 30% would be a great commission.
Wow.
And the fact is that, he wasn't even thinking in biblical terms. Generally, the phrase Great Commission is assigned to the Matthew 28:18 through 20 speech of Jesus, where he comes and basically says he's given all authority Okay, he sends them to all the nations, which we'll get to in a minute. He wants us to teach people to obey all the things he has taught us, and he promises to be with us always, all in the process of making disciples.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned the Matthew 28 passage. Is that the only place that we find the Great Commission?
That's an important note that it's not the only place. As a matter of fact, from Easter night till the day that Jesus ascends into heaven, those 40 days after the resurrection, Jesus gives some variation on this compelling message to go into all the world. In Matthew 28, as we just mentioned, in Mark 16, preach the gospel to all creation. In Luke 24, it's the power of the Holy Spirit to be witnesses to all the nations. In Acts 1:8, which is Luke part 2, as you know, and that's, be my witnesses, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. And then the most abbreviated form was on Easter night. But when Jesus, who up to that point had referred to himself in the Gospel of John more than 40 times as being sent on Easter night, he now says, as the Father has sent me, now I'm sending you. And so basically over these 40 days, Jesus is basically saying, sort of in the spirit of last word and testament, if you don't remember anything else, remember this. Go to all the nations, be my witnesses, be filled with the Holy Spirit, cross-cultural barriers, and remember that I'm with you no matter where you go.
Well, it's very good. Just to be reminded, too, it's not just one verse, but it's a theme that the Lord Jesus was emphasizing in his final days, a final assignment, if you will, and his in-person days. Let's use Matthew 28 as our key text here and drill into this a little bit, unpack it. You've mentioned some of them already, but let's really bring them out. What are some of the key elements of the Great Commission?
Well, you could look at it in two different ways. One is to look at the superlatives. Jesus starts off and he says, all authority is given to me, keeping in mind the fact that when he stands in front of those disciples, if you envision his hands being outstretched, the light is showing through the holes in his hands. So I've just conquered death, combined with the phrase all authority, is pretty much a great endorsement of the reality that he's just conquered death. That gives him the authority. And he says, I want you to go and make disciples of all the nations. That's the second superlative. I want you to teach people to obey all the things that I've commanded you, and I am with you always. So those four superlatives are one way to look at it. But the most common way to look at it is to look at the verbiage, the way Jesus structures his language. And even though it's imperatives for us, go and make disciples, it's actually participles followed by an imperative. And it's as you are going, so he presumes we're going, as you are teaching, as you are baptizing, make disciples. So the whole process of discipleship is going, probably across cultures or at least across the street, teaching, and not just teaching in the intellectual sense, but teaching people to obey, and baptizing, which would be a conscious identification with the Christian community. In that process, make disciples.
Jesus did say that we're to make disciples of all nations. What's meant by this idea of all nations here? What did he have in mind?
It's helpful, and again, you can do this yourselves just by reading commentaries, but it's helpful to realize that when we think of all nations, we might think of the 200 plus, political entities on earth or members of the United Nations. But the Greek language is all the ethnic groups. Panta ta ethne is the Greek phrase. And basically, Jesus is saying, basically cross every culture with the gospel. Don't let anybody be left out. So India, for example, is one geopolitical nation, but it might be 1,600 ethne in terms of ethnic specific groups. And so oftentimes in missions world, when you start hearing about unreached people groups, what that's talking about is the ethnic groups that have not yet heard or received the gospel, or at least the church has not yet been planted in their midst. And so it's a much broader term than just make sure there are Christians in 200 nations. It's make sure that every ethnic group has the chance to receive the gospel. And then you see that fulfilled later on in the book of Revelation.
Right.
You see people from every tribe and tongue and nation, same word, worshiping Jesus. What that means is that the Christians, us, we've been obedient to take the gospel across all the cultures of the earth.
Mm-hmm. Well, what an assignment that is. I would just mention here, in a previous episode, we have visited with the creators of JoshuaProject.net, which is a website and a resource that would allow our listeners to learn about the ethne, about the people groups. It's possible to look at the geopolitical entities there, like India, like you said, Paul, India, but it also breaks India down into those several hundred, many hundreds of people groups there, and their access to the gospel as well. So an excellent tool, JoshuaProject.net. Paul, I just wonder about this idea of making disciples. And if we could just unpack that, what is discipleship exactly? To make disciples, what does that look like then?
Well, discipleship is a lifelong process. And unfortunately, especially in the Western world, the Europe and North American world especially, we've been better at making converts, meaning getting people to make a one-time decision, raise their hand, I want to go to heaven, I want my sins forgiven, which is all part of in a sense, the inauguration into discipleship. But discipleship is the 24/7 follower. It's the person who is seeking to have Jesus integrated into every part of their lives. It's fully devoted followers, as somebody else has called it. Basically, that's why you look at that passage in Matthew 28, teaching them to obey all the things that I've commanded you. A lot more of us believe the things Jesus has commanded us, but the issue is not belief. The issue is obedience. And the fully devoted follower is the person who is looking to make Christ's priorities his or her priorities in every area of their lives. What Paul the Apostle refers to in Colossians chapter 1:28 as presenting every person, complete in Christ. And none of us are ever at that point, but it is the process that we're moving towards. And it's not Jesus as a category of my life or Jesus as a safety net in my life. It's Jesus in every part of my life. Years ago, Robert Boyd Munger wrote a little booklet called My Heart, Christ's Home. And it's it's a parable of Jesus being invited into our house. And we want to keep him in the living room where we can control everything and offer the hospitality. But Jesus wants to get into our closets. He wants to get into our kitchens to address our appetites. He wants to get into our bedrooms to address our sexuality. He wants to get into our closets to identify some of the things we don't want to talk about. He wants to be part of every room in our heart, in our lives. And that, to me, is a great description of what discipleship is. And thus, it's a long-term process. I mean, we're all in process of growing into Christ-likeness.
One of the challenges that we have been facing in global missions, and I serve in an organization that seeks to identify and help prepare, recruit, if you will, new mission workers to go cross-culturally, is how effectively we are discipling here, quote unquote, at home in North America. And are we making disciples even here at home? It's very poignant, the ideas that you've brought out here, and a bit of a challenge to us. Are we making disciples? Are we ourselves faithful disciples before we go and try and make disciples? Well, we've had a helpful overview of this great commission that comes from Jesus. Paul, as we start to make this practical then for us as Christ followers, what does this mean now? What does the Great Commission mean to the average person sitting in a pew in their local church?
Well, it's a great question because many times when we hear the phrase the Great Commission or we talk about making disciples of all the nations, it gives us an image of the cross-cultural missionary, the full-time person who's dedicated themselves to going to Timbuktu in Mali, North Africa, or something like that. But in addition to the fact that the Great Commission is for all of the church for all time until Jesus comes back, that's why in Matthew 28, he says, I am with you to the end of the age. The implication being we're going to be doing these things until the end of the age, namely making disciples. but it's a call to every Christian every day. In other words, we're supposed to be living lives as those who are sent into the world. The way that I like to refer to it is out of John's Gospel, chapter 20, where Jesus says, as the Father has sent me, now I'm sending you. We who are followers of Christ, we don't need to ask God if we are sent. We only need to ask God where we are sent, because we're supposed to be living sent lives every day to the best of our God-given ability. And related to that, the Great Commission statements, Matthew 28, Luke 24, all creation, Mark 16, and Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the ends of the earth, Acts chapter 1, all of them have sort of an emphasis on taking the gospel across cultures. And that could mean across the street. It could mean across the hall to that foreign worker in your office place. It could mean the international student, but basically looking for the opportunity to give and share the gospel with someone who's never had it before. And that's the kind of emphasis that living the Great Commission has for us every day as Christians, whether we're so-called full-time in, professional Christian ministry, or we're followers of Jesus in the marketplace.
So it has implications for everyone. Excellent. In just a moment, we're going to have Paul share with us some practical examples of how Christ followers can and are participating in the Great Commission today. Just before we get to those questions, we'd like to share with you a resource that we hope will be helpful to you and your church.
InnerServe is a community of men and women using our skills and experience to do kingdom work among the people of Asia and the Arab world. We believe God has given each of us interests, skills, and talents. We believe He has led us into programs of study, fields of education, and career paths so that we can use our vocations to live a holistic ministry among the least reached people in the world. We aim to see lives and communities transformed through encounter with Jesus. To learn how you can get involved, visit innerservecanada.org. And now, back to today's conversation.
Okay, we're back with Paul Borthwick, who's been helping us understand this idea, these instructions of Jesus called the Great Commission. Paul, you've helpfully described some of the key components in the Great Commission and that it applies to all of us as Christ followers. Would you share some examples of how you have seen Christ followers participating in the Great Commission today?
Well, because of the emphasis that I just gave about going across cultures, the first couple that comes to my mind is a couple named Bill and Judy, who have been doing discipleship amongst international students for probably 40 years now. And they specifically have been emphasizing those students coming to the U.S., that's where we live, and from China. And it starts with invitation. It starts with discussion. They ask all sorts of questions. They offer hospitality. But they're ongoing, sharing Christ along the way. And in the process are showing a sort of a magnetic image of what it means to become a follower of Jesus, so much so that these students want to do the same. And that's, I think, what it means to make disciples, to be, as you were saying a moment ago offline, to be disciples and to make disciples. And they are living the life of seeing people through the eyes of Christ and reaching out across cultures to make disciples, and then to send those disciples back to parts of China that they could never go to themselves.
Mm-hmm. So here's this idea of international students, a wonderful example. I heard an unfortunate statistic, actually, that many, I can't remember the numbers exactly, but many international students have come to North America, studied sometimes for 4 years to do a degree or a graduate degree, something like that, and they have never been invited into a home. They often appreciate it.
International Students Incorporated used to say that statistic was about 75 or 80% at least, never got to see more than the campus or the dormitory. And I went to a very, very secular university. If a student goes back to their motherland thinking that's normal American life, we're in big trouble, And I think that that kind of hospitality and advocacy for refugees, hospitality for the new person in the midst, but even just looking for opportunities to engage neighbors. My wife and I are spending some of the winter months in Florida. And coming from the Boston area, we're not very accustomed to just how Christian some parts of America can be. And interestingly, we met some neighbors, and like in the fourth conversation we had with them, they invited us to go with them to church. And I'm thinking to myself, now that's an interesting thing, because that was the first time in my entire life anybody's ever invited me to go to church. Wow. And but just that kind of day-to-day looking out for the visitor, looking out for the newcomer, and looking out for the person who might have a need, so that you can begin that process of relationship that becomes discipleship, that becomes fruitfulness in their lives.
Mm-hmm. And all of this is right where we are. My wife was just given for her birthday this little sign that says, "Bloom where you are planted." And that's what came to our minds, that the Lord has put us in a place, all of us in a place. The question is not if we are sent, it's to whom or where are we sent, even right where we are.
Exactly.
Now, some of these ideas do lead us to cross-cultural and to faraway places, as we have highlighted in this podcast at times. The majority of unreached peoples are not in North America and will very likely not have an opportunity to come to North America, to come to us. So just talk to us a little bit about the examples of the goers who will go to some of those places. What have you seen unfolding in those avenues?
Well, in those areas, of course, the most significant thing is the person, to the best of his or her ability, they get fully engaged in the culture itself. The greatest challenge of which, of course, is language, but living the Christian life in front of people, so that people, as I said earlier in the broadcast, people see the gospel even before they hear the gospel. And that could be anything from the way we treat each other in our teams, or it could be the way we reach out to our community. It could be the way we look to better the community, whether or not they're fellow Christians or not. But basically going into that community and to use the words out of Matthew 28, as you are going and as you are teaching and as you are baptizing, make disciples. And that's a long-term process of investment in another culture, especially for the international worker going to share that gospel with people.
Mm-hmm. Here I just on a little bit of a rabbit trail, it implies, Paul, that it's going to take longer-term missions than sometimes we're often engaging in from North America. Can you just speak to the blend of short-term and long-term mission in these efforts?
I'm not an anti-short-term mission person if the short-term mission has a distinct goal. Mm-hmm. If the distinct goal of the 2 weeks in some place is to give people a vision for unreached peoples, it can start. It can do that. Mm-hmm. Actually, one of the side benefits, I believe, of short-term missions is that we come back to our regular culture where we live day to day and actually have a story to tell. Because when people say, "What did you do on your summer vacation?" If you say, "Well, I went to Egypt and did this and such," then inevitable next question is why. But the only way that unreached peoples are really going to be reached is by people who invest long-term with those people. I remember talking with a person who was working in the Hindu world, primarily Hindu world, and they said that they estimated it took 10 years of friendship for a Hindu to become a Christian. And people working in Muslim cultures say a very similar thing. So in other words, short-term missions is great for creating vision and fostering prayer, but it's not necessarily going to get the work done of getting the gospel communicated. Those people I mentioned, even who are working with international students, they'll do it over a 4 to 6 year period of study in the United States before they see much fruit. Mm-hmm. And we need to get a grip of the fact that making disciples is being a disciple for a long time in the life of someone we're trying to touch.
Mm-hmm. Wise words. Appreciate that. Now, Paul, if you had the opportunity to stand before a missions committee, let's imagine the hall is full of people serving on missions committees or mission leaders in a local church, and you had the opportunity to address them, what would you want to say to them?
Well, to their own church leadership, I would probably say, number one, that global mission starts in our own communities. It's Jerusalem, it's Judea, it's Samaria, it's to the end of the earth. Number two, in their local community, I would strongly encourage them to be go and tell Christians rather than come and see. In the places in our world, whether it's the Bible Belt in Canada or the Bible Belt in the United States, many times we think evangelism is inviting people to church. And evangelism and discipleship is going into the community to reach people. It's going and telling rather than coming and seeing. Mm-hmm. On a global scale, I would tell them to make sure that some of the people they're working with, partnering with, supporting, are indeed going to some of these unreached ethnic-specific groups. And the fourth thing I would tell them probably is make sure that there are people on your missionary support roster who don't look like the culture of your church, because now the church is multicultural and there are people going from every nation to every nation. And if we're going to be serious about reaching some of these unreached ethnic groups, somebody like me, European heritage from North America, might not be the best person to reach that tribe in northern India. It might be somebody going from Brazil, and that's the partner we want to have. So I just encourage churches to make sure that their missions family is bigger than just fellow North Americans from the same cultural background as themselves.
Great, wise advice there. Just to remind our listeners, if you happen to be new, that we take show notes, and all of these points that Paul is making, we collect, and you can get that at globalmissionspodcast.com if you want to see those points again. Paul, I just want to mention your book again, The Great Commission, Great Compassion. In that book, Paul gives many examples and principles about how to get involved with the Great Commission. What other resources would you recommend to our listeners or to churches who want to participate in the Great Commission?
Well, I would say participation in the Great Commission starts with the whole issue of discipleship. And the navigators, who are some of the most skilled at this, if you will, they've given the most thought to making disciples, have one called the Navigator Complete Book of Discipleship, which really wrestles with all sorts of issues in terms of how do you see your own life transformed, how do you see other people's lives transformed. When it comes to participation in the Great Commission going across cultures, one thing that I would really recommend to churches and individuals is to get a copy of Winfried Corduan's book, Neighboring Faiths. It's an InterVarsity Press book that basically is an encyclopedic type of volume on all the different other religions of the world. And why I like it is because if we're going across cultures, oftentimes we don't even know what to say when someone says they're a Sikh, or someone says they're a Buddhist, or someone says they're from Shiite Islam. But in his book, every chapter has a description of what these religions teach or believe. But at the end of every chapter is a section called So You Meet a, and then whatever the religion is, so you meet a Sikh, and then it gives you 25 or 30 questions you could use to start a discussion to learn from them. And I advocate that because so many of the unreached people groups of the world are now in New York or Toronto or Vancouver or Houston, that maybe some of those unreached people groups are going to be reached by people who are reaching out across cultures in their own communities in North America.
Wow. It sounds like a great resource. We'll be checking that one out for sure. And we also put all these book titles or resources into the show notes as well. You can find those notes there. Paul, if any of our guests would like to reach out to you, follow up with you, how could they do that?
The easiest thing is just to go to www.paulborthwick.com. That's my name, no dots, no spaces, but paulborthwick.com. And there's a tab on that that says Contact Me. That's the easiest way because that gets forwarded to any and all emails that I have. And that's the best way to reach me.
Okay. Well, thanks for helping us open this topic and to just review the foundations of what we're doing here. Just a really fascinating discussion with all kinds of potential in it. You might want to wind it back. Please refer this episode to others that you think might benefit from it as well. And Paul, to you, we say thank you very much for spending this time with us today.
Thanks for having me again.
Well, that concludes our conversation with Paul. Thanks for joining us. I want to encourage you to take some time today to reflect on how you are participating in the Great Commission. Are you, in fact, blooming where the Lord has planted you And would you pray about the possibility of participating even more broadly in the Great Commission, perhaps being a goer or a sender to the ends of the earth? Remember that you can find the show notes for today's episode at globalmissionspodcast.com, including links to the resources that Paul mentioned. That's it for today. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International and the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of our team, thanks for listening. Join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.